Welcome back to Dreaming Against the Machine. I'm your host, Adam Becker. This week's guest is Professor Susannah Glickman, who's a historian at Stony Brook University. And she's an expert on, among other things, the history of science in the U.S. in the mid-20th century. And that's why I wanted her on the podcast this week. One of the running questions on this show, as you'll know if you've listened to most of the earlier episodes, is there's been a surprisingly durable picture of the future in the American psyche that really seems to come from 1950s science fiction of like rocket ships and chrome as the inevitable future or the place where the future is supposed to be. And I've been wondering for a long time why that's been such a persistent idea in American culture in particular. And that's why I brought Susannah on the show. She is someone who really understands a lot about how science has presented itself to the American public, how science thinks of itself, and where different ideas about the future of science and technology have come from. And so I wanted to talk with her about that. And I think you're going to enjoy the conversation that we had. It was a fun one. So let's get to it. Susannah, welcome to Dreaming Against the Machine.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm just glad we made this work out because you're on the road right now.
Yeah, I've been running around doing talks. I'm luckily, very fortunately, on research leave, so I shouldn't complain about that. But I have been doing a lot of traveling.
Just to give our guests a sense of who you are, how would you describe your work?
I was trained in sort of a traditional American history department, but I have a background in mathematics and anthropology. Specifically within mathematics, I did like a year-long research thesis on optimizing quantum algorithms and then was hired to continue that work. So I have a little bit of a technical side of a humanistic side. And then presently, my work sits at the intersection of like U.S. history, political economy, which is like economics, but a little bit more expansive than the discipline as it currently exists. And like history of tech, especially physics and computing. I'm very interested in how the national security state as a part of that has transformed.
Well, history of physics is one of my passions as well. I wrote a whole book on history of quantum physics. But I think I may have told you that when we talked before, when I decided that you had to come onto this podcast, whether you liked it or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, the main thing, I mean, we met on a call a few weeks back, and the main thing I wanted to talk with you about, or one of the things I wanted to talk with you about, was you seem like a likely candidate to be able to give me a good answer to a question that I have been kind of obsessed with for a while and have asked a couple of other guests on this show as well, which is there's this mid-20th century chrome-plated rocket ship vision of the future that has been surprisingly durable. You know, the kind of thing that that you found on like the front cover of Astounding Science Fiction and stuff like that in 1950 is still, 75 plus years later, this idea of what the future is. The future is with rocket ships in space. I don't understand why that idea has been so culturally durable, especially here in the US.
One of the weird things about being a historian is you just see like everything happening over and over again. And the same words, even like reskilling is one of those. But also these imaginations of the future coming from that post-war period. Now, I'm kind of interested in the way that there's like a break between those two periods, but I think there is something about the vision of the future that's maintained. So I think there's like this original construction of like a scientific state apparatus and political economy around that like codifies some elements of the World War II state. And that is brought into full maturity with like sort of the Vannevar Bush era of like imagining, physicists and basic research as like the prototypical model for the science-state relationship, much like it was in World War II. That's stable until like maybe the mid-1960s. Okay. I'm reading a book that's making me rethink the periodization even earlier. That's like an annoying historian thing to do. But part of that, that Vannevar Bush vision of like this relationship between state science and industry is remade in sort of like calling upon those same moments in those same imaginaries, but in a very different like structure, beginning with the erosion of that original World War II research state, or like the Cold War part of it. And it transforms into like kind of more the big tech model, where you have venture capital, you have these life cycle models, and they appropriate, I think there are certain features of that conversion that maintain a sort of imaginary of the future that is very consistent. It is weird, right? That like the kinds of things that Elon Musk's saying are always on the horizon and never arrive, like that those are consistent from I think the 70s and 80s. But I think what this maybe does for us, this periodization, is that it's not so much a product of the post-Cold War period, but like they're products of like the Cold War model maybe like falling apart, and this need to like reauthorize, to reimagine like what science can do for society. That like physicists start freaking out about this due to like defense cuts and all of these kinds of business efficiencies that are brought into government in a bipartisan way in the mid to late 60s. I think these things are related. I think there's this great American Institute of Physics meeting where they're really worried about this. It's like, I think 1967, 1968. And they're like, you know, we did the bomb, we did radar, we did all this like amazing stuff. But it's not enough to convince government and the public that they need to continue funding our institutions. Like they think DARPA might go away. They think all these things might go away. And so we have to like offer a different model of like what we do for society. And a bunch of them become convinced that like physics had this purchase on the future, right? Like you could use physics to predict like where objects would be in space in the future. And that was wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm cribbing like John Wheeler's archives. He's like, oh, this gave like, you know, physics this special authority.
We're going to talk
power.
about John Wheeler. Yeah.
I love
yes.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
So Wheeler's like, oh, like we had this purchase on the future, but actually like quantum physics really unsettles this. And like, we don't have this anymore, but you know what does? Computing, which again, the relationship of physics and computation is something that Peter Galison has written a lot about, for instance, but like, they have this really credulous relationship to computing that is not shared by computing experts themselves, right? Like Rebecca Slayton has this great book about the evolution of, or the emergence of software engineering as a field unto itself. And like, they're much less credulous about what computers can do and their purchase on the future and like truth and nature, right? In reality. But physicists, because of Monte Carlo simulations and their role in sort of simulating the bomb and like simulating physics, this idea that you could simulate all kinds of physics, quantum, right, obviously complicates that.
Yes.
Gives physicists this real belief in the power of computing. And so Wheeler in this moment is like, well, yeah, so we have to like build this closer relationship with computing, or like all these physicists, it's not just him, but all these physicists get really interested in this period in computing because it seems to be something that would have this greater purchase on the future at the same time as they're reconstructing the case in the institutions attendant to that for like why you should fund them, their students, big science. And what comes out of it is very different, right, than the World War II state, but we can get to that.
Okay. I have so many questions, and there's also a lot of things we need to unpack.
Yes. Yeah.
So Vannevar Bush publishes in what, like 1946, The Endless Frontier, right? Which is this
somewhere around there.
Yeah, somewhere around there. So like right after World War II, Vannevar Bush, who is how would you describe him? Scientific administrator?
Yeah. And proto-entrepreneur. I mean, there's like really interesting things that have been written about him, and like he had this like commitment to basic science, but maybe was a little bit more applied in practice. However you want to divide those categories. But yeah, so he ends up proposing the National Science Foundation, the NSF. And, you know, helping to build a bunch of the post-war science, the military industrial complex, you know, the triple helix, the Cold War triple helix, however you want to talk about it.
Hold on. What is the Cold War triple helix?
Between academia, science, the government, and industry.
Okay. Yeah.
And the government, again, I think, it's not just defense, but it is a lot of defense.
So Bush publishes this thing saying like science is an endless frontier, explicitly invoking this frontier metaphor. this idea of a scientific frontier and this post-World War II vision of a sort of shiny physics, rockets, and chrome future lasted until sometime into the 60s and then sort of got reinterpreted, and parts of it persisted to the present, but parts of it sort of shifted over to being more focused on computers and computation, and ultimately ended up with this like Silicon Valley model. So along the way to answering the question that I asked you, you're also answering a different question, which is how is it that these, you know, tech billionaires became the guardians of this fantastical vision of the future, for better or for worse? Spoiler alert, for worse, not for better. But yeah.
I mean, I think there's so many different things happening that all kind of complement each other at the same time. So, I'm probably leaving out part of the story that someone would add, but
Sure.
I think it is the case that like the sort of physicist-centered model of the future has to be rearticulated,
Yeah.
and the state, like this research apparatus, research industrial, scientific, defense, government apparatus gets remade beginning in the late 60s. There's this big crisis of funding, defense cuts, but really that like applies to like the entire scientific infrastructure. And out of that, you get certain new visions of what the future is going to be like, new ways of telling history, right? Like the transistor, the computer, these become sort of models, and they offer models of history, right? So Moore's law, for instance, which is, I mean, it has come to mean many different things, but it's like this,
Yes.
a log graph. So log means like you can present an exponential curve as a line going up by taking the logarithm, so the rate of change. And Moore's law is a log graph that just shows a line going up and tells a story about the relationship between computing power, speed, and size, right? That like things
Sure.
get smaller, cheaper, and faster in standard increments.
I want to just jump in and say, like, one way of explaining Moore's law is you can double the number of transistors that you can cram into the same space on a silicon chip every 18 or 24 months, depending on which formulation you want to look at, right? Something like that.
Yeah. And so, and again, it's like, it means very different things to different people, like how it works
Sure.
is, it's just,
Yes.
but it is like the image itself is a way of telling history and a way of projecting the future at the same time. And we are maybe less attendant to the ways in which it shapes our understanding of the past and more attentive to the way it shapes our understanding of the future. But I think
Yep.
these things are related. And I
Yep.
think like the tech CEO as the person delivering this in the popular imaginary, like means that, okay, so then they understand like you have to fund these industries in a specific way to maintain Moore's law. Moore's law is something that can perpetually be in crisis. And like, right, the role of Moore's law has changed over time. So I don't want to say that it's a monolith or that it hasn't shifted and the power in the tech industry hasn't shifted, which it totally has.
This is fascinating because in my book, my latest book, not the first book about quantum physics, More Everything Forever, I talk about Moore's law, and I say, it's not a law of nature. It was a decision made by people running the semiconductor industry, that this was something that they were going to shoot for. And you're saying, yeah, it was, and it's also a way of justifying actions and funding requests and saying, like, we have to stay on this track in order to save Moore's law.
Yeah, I mean, if we're going to get really specific about it, Moore's Law starts as like a marketing tool because, like, it turns out Intel doesn't actually have better products than its competitors, but what they're able to do is to sell not just the products, but the promise that it's going to continue, increasing at these intervals. And like Moore's plot becomes a big part of advertising, especially within the industry. Then there's a shift where it's sort of mathematized by this guy at IBM named Robert Dennard and made more into like sort of it's scientized. And it makes people believe in the future of silicon, which again, one of the ways in which Moore's law remakes our understanding of the past is that silicon as a medium for transistors, as a medium for computing, is taken for granted. But at the time, it was not at all clear, right, that this would work technically. And so Moore's law is a part of selling that, the mathematization of it, and like sort of the the kind of work that Carver Mead, the scientist at Caltech, who also becomes a big proselytizer for Moore's law and for silicon as a medium, takes up and makes very popular. So it becomes very popular. And then in the late 70s, Japan emerges as this really impressive technological power, and one that's threatening core industries in the US, including electronics. And so there's, the Japanese model, which is quite different from American capitalism, does two things, right? It causes this crisis for American capitalism. There's the 70s question of can we grow forever? But then there's also the question of, is the American model the right model if the Japanese are overtaking US industry? And then within the industry, okay, so in order to beat the Japanese, we're going to have to come up with a different way of doing things. That includes a lot of planning. So individual companies start planning, then consortia start planning. And then eventually, by the time you get to the first Bush administration and then Clinton, you get these national planning efforts. And they use things like Moore's law as a model originally, and then eventually just call what they're doing Moore's law. And they build it into these roadmaps that coordinate the entire industry, suppliers, the scope keeps building and building, using, US power to do so into the early 2000s, when things start to fall apart for various reasons, around 2006.
Why did things start falling apart?
That's a question that many people are trying to answer. And there's so many different kinds of answers. It's the focus of my research. So one of the things that happens, right, is the separation of the design and the manufacture model. Apple went to Intel actually to manufacture chips for the iPhone, right? But Intel thought the money we make per chip is just not worth it. Why don't we'll send you to TSMC. They end up working with TSMC. And that creates this separated design, or makes it clear that this model works. Clinton era national investment in coordinated investment, government investment falls off. Some of the gains that you can get from the industrial investment that you can get, not legislatively, but through trade, right? And through using US power outside the US instead of doing domestic policy, some of that becomes less effective. There's just so many different things going on. But these are all elements of why that model stops working. It's so overdetermined. That's a book unto itself.
But here we are in this world where the chips are just not made in the US and are in fact pretty much just made in one place.
It depends on what kind of chip, but
Sure,
leading edge chips are either mostly made in Taiwan. Some certain kinds are made in South Korea.
And the lithography machines are all coming from this one company in the Netherlands, right?
Yeah. Which is why I've been spending a lot of time in the Netherlands.
And there we go. And hold on. So lithography is this process where you etch the stuff that you need to etch into the silicon in order to turn it into a bunch of transistors on a chip.
It's the factory machines that make chips. So you need machines to make machines. It turns out this is and they have a monopoly in a way that is sort of more entrenched and harder to replicate than, say, TSMC's monopoly on leading edge chips.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But we've gotten very technical and maybe pulling back to visions of the future.
Exactly what I want to do.
This created the substrate, right? This creates okay, there are real things happening. Computers are getting smaller and faster and more powerful. But there's an infrastructure behind it. There's a way in which ideology and this marketing device has been built into infrastructure, which then creates this stability for this way of telling history and predicting the future. Like Moore's law, like this line go up, but it gets generalized. It's this is how technological development happens. And, a lot of these same policy tools or, we just generalize it out in a way that gives technologists, especially consultants, right, about tech, this power. I mean, there's also movement within economics, right, to say, okay, it used to be just growth is capital plus labor.
Yeah.
And it turns out, it's obviously more complicated, but that's the model until I guess mid-century, when all these economists start thinking about, and actually some other management consultants, proto-management consultants, start thinking about technology having a role, sort of playing why some economies do better than others. So there are a lot of parallel things happening, but it ends up locating that in tech.
And this generalized idea that Moore's law is like a model for how technology works as a whole gets us to a whole set of ideas that I'm perpetually fascinated by. Like, this is where you get someone like Ray Kurzweil.
Yeah. Or you get this way of telling human history that starts with like fire, and then, I don't know, I'm going to butcher this, fire, like the steam engine, then, you can tell these modeled stages of history, which again, there are precedents for, right? Like there's,
Yeah.
Stages history in terms of like feudalism, capitalism, socialism, or communism, but they sort of gets adapted to this linear model too, right?
Yeah.
But where technology is the agent of history.
And you see this over and over again in the way that people in Silicon Valley talk about the future. They just talk about, oh, we're going to have this technology and this technology and this technology, and it's going to solve all of our current problems. And I don't want to say I'm confused by it. I'm just amazed that they believe that you can solve every single problem with technology. There's so many obvious counterexamples to it. I don't understand how because some of them are grifters, but some of them really believe this stuff, and it's very hard for me to understand how they can do that.
Intent is kind of a hard thing, because it's like, where do my interests end and where do my beliefs begin? And I don't know. I can't get in someone's head, but the weird thing that it does, right, is it's not people who are agents of history, right? History is driven by technology, and there are people who can speak for technology and what technology needs. At first it's like physicists, it's like other people, but now it's like, these entrepreneurs. But it's the technology that's acting, and it's particularly, for me, it's like a pet peeve about the way people talk about AI. It's like, AI is speeding up my work. And it's like, no, your employer is speeding up your work, making you work more for less. Or like, AI is like inevitably going to do X, Y, and Z. It's like, no, these are political decisions made by employers, bosses, regulators, politicians. People are doing things with technology. Technology is not acting on its own. Technology, and especially AI, can be the medium through which people experience these kinds of political and social relationships. They're displaced, right? But it is not the cause of them. And I think that confusion is something, it's like worth changing the way we talk about technology. So it's not like the technology acting. Let's locate the specific people who are making these kinds of decisions, or not making any decisions, right? And as the case may be.
Yeah, no, when you talk like that, it absolves the individuals involved of any sort of responsibility, and just saying, oh no, it's the technology. This is what the technology is doing.
Well, and back to what you're saying, it's like, it defers questions, or it subsumes, it hides questions that are really political and social questions, where like technology is the agent, is the actor, in a way that I think like makes it really hard to do the kinds of politics we need to do to escape this paradigm.
Unfortunately, we still live in capitalism, and that means we need to talk about our partners and sponsors. But fortunately, our partners and sponsors are great. And if you want to support Dreaming Against the Machine directly, you can join us on Patreon, where $5 a month gives you the chance to ask questions of upcoming guests and a dedicated stream of cat pictures. We love our patrons, and we also love being a part of the Multitude Collective at multitudeshows.com. Multitude is a podcast company made up of passionate people creating shows you can count on. Shows like American Medieval, a podcast about the Middle Ages, but with an American twist. Every week, Professor Matthew Gabriel is joined by an expert scholar to talk about either some bit of the medieval world itself, or how Americans have, throughout our history, used the Middle Ages to say something about ourselves. If America has never been fully modern, it might be because we've always been a little bit medieval. Check out AmericanMedieval.com for more. New episodes are available every Wednesday. And here's a word from our sponsors. One of this week's sponsors is Shaker and Spoon, a monthly cocktail and mocktail subscription. Full disclosure, they sent me a free box this month, and I'm excited to try it on a night off soon. Each box includes 3 original recipes from award-winning bartenders, with enough ingredients to make 4 of each of those drinks for at least 12 drinks in total. And each box includes everything you need to make the drink except for the alcohol, and they're built around 1 spirit per box, so you really just need 1 bottle of something that you probably already have on hand if you drink. And if you don't drink, every box includes 0 proof options for every recipe, and some of the drinks are designed to be completely spirit-free from the start. The boxes come with recipe cards that include guidance on mixing techniques and glossary of terms that teach you how to shake, stir, build, and garnish these unusual cocktails with eclectic ingredients. And they also include everything else that you need to try out these drinks, like custom syrups, bitters, extracts, garnishes, and aromatics. And so you can try the drinks without going off and buying full bottles of niche ingredients that you'll never use again. It's a great idea for date nights or hosting a party or bringing a gift to someone else's party. And you can always skip or swap boxes or even just buy individual kits or ingredients without subscribing. So you can try this stuff out at their website, shakerandspoon.com. Use code DATM for 10% off your purchase. Let's talk about John Wheeler.
Yeah, hell yeah.
Yeah, hell yeah. Because like there's a bunch of other stuff that I could bring up, and maybe we'll get to it later, but I want to make sure that we talk about John Wheeler. Because, talking about people who have a particular idea of what the future of science is going to be, and also talking about people who were influential within physics and also the relationship between physics and the government. John Wheeler, God, how do I explain to our listeners who John Wheeler is? John Wheeler is one of the most influential physicists you've never heard of. He's a guy who worked with basically every major physicist of the 20th century. He has many famous doctoral students and collaborators, and is also influential within physics in terms of setting research programs. And even though he lived a very long time, but he's been dead now for something like 20 years, but his influence is still with us.
I don't believe in the great man theory of history at all, but he is very useful for tracing the arc of certain institutions in US history through that, right? So when I'm telling, histories of technology, these are really social and political histories.
Yes.
Physicists in the post-war period become statesmen, right? They're diplomats, they're redesigning the state, and Wheeler is a huge part of that. And this is Gary Will's Bomb Power and a bunch of other work, right? Is they take the Manhattan Project and they're like, okay, we're going to institutionalize this. And so the physicists, right, who are very involved in designing that end up having this huge role in building the Cold War state and maintaining the Cold War state. Wheeler's one of them. Again, he's also, right, you're talking with this guy who came up, is important and influential in the concept of black holes. So many different functions.
Yeah.
He's a huge part of quantum information science too. And the move toward quantum computing. Less well known, helped build the field of the history of science and history and philosophy of science as it exists in its current form as a separate field from history proper, and one involving many more practitioners and technicians than historians. So he's very involved in setting up these archives. He's corresponding
I didn't
with
know
Kuhn.
that.
He's fascinating. He's fascinating for all these reasons. I started out because I was optimizing quantum algorithms. My original question coming to grad school was, okay, so I'm working on optimizing these algorithms, but these computers might never exist. Why is this happening? I think this is awesome math. It's really fun math.
Yeah.
For me, I loved abstract algebra. I loved linear algebra. I was it's great that group theory has an application finally. And then I was wait, why am I doing this? And my supervisor had all these really interesting answers, but none of them were satisfying. So I got interested in where does the infrastructure and support for this come from? And Wheeler, that's what brought me to Wheeler, is the quantum angle.
Yeah.
And so I follow him in the sense that he is very interested in marrying physics and computing through quantum and solving a bunch of the disciplinary problems and intellectual problems happening and material problems, right? Physics funding happening in physics by sort of imagining quantum computing as an answer to that. He's very influential in defense contracting.
Yes.
So let's see, he sets up the JSONs.
Hold on. No. We got to back up. There's a bunch of different things we got to get into here, but what are the JSONs?
So it's mostly physicists. Wheeler and a couple other people set it up. And it's this group who advises federal science policy.
Yeah.
Right. And where to invest, where to not invest. And it is primarily physicists. So he does that. Yeah, a bunch of his students get very involved in defense contracting, and especially the integration of computing into defense. His student, Hugh Everett,
who is Also, one of the central figures in my first book, What is Real, available wherever fine books are sold. But yeah, yes, no, Hugh Everett is like one of the main guys here. Anyway, please keep going.
He helps Hugh Everett in his endeavor to become this computing like defense contractor. He founds this. Everett's company is called Lambda Corporation. I think it's founded in like 1964, and it's focused on integrating computing into defense. They do all sorts of things, but they do a lot of wargaming and a lot of like computer simulations of like the end of the world, it's atomic warfare. But Wheeler is very influential in setting it up. I found this document in Wheeler's archive where he's like pushing for Everett to get a higher level of classified access in 1968, and he's writing this general, and this general basically just like says, okay, sure, whatever. So
wait,
I mean, it's
really?
yeah.
Okay. I gotta jump in here. This is crazy. So my first book, What is Real, is a history of quantum foundations, and so
Amazing.
Of course Wheeler shows up in there a lot, and Hugh Everett shows up in there a lot. And quantum foundations is something I haven't talked about on this podcast yet. So what is quantum foundations? Quantum foundations is basically the area of research that tries to figure out what it is that quantum physics is saying about the world. And has turned out to be like one of the weirdest things in the history of physics is that is a really contentious, like knockdown, drag out fight that has been going on for over a century at this point.
And weirdly, it's like the subtext of a lot of history of computing. Like Wheeler's really invested in it, but not just Wheeler, like Carver Mead. To this day, when I interviewed him like a couple of years back, he was still very focused on questions of quantum foundations, like these are the big questions of our age. Now, this is not something that the general public spends a lot of time thinking about, but I think this is the preoccupation of this generation of scientists, because it's such a weird, counterintuitive thing. It breaks physics purchase on the future, but also it does this really interesting thing to the scientific method, which is like no longer are observer and observed separate categories. And in a way, like social science is dealing with that on its own terms. Like, I think people in my field think that's an original insight. It's not. It's like really something like, the quantum physicists are like, wait, what do we do about this?
Yeah.
Like, this is a huge deal. You can't have this neat separation. You can't have these neat experiments. And so what do? Do you remake the scientific method around this insight? They don't, but they don't know what to do with it, right? They don't know what it means. They don't know what to do with it. It's this huge intellectual crisis happening at the same time as all of these like material crises are hitting the field. And these political crises are hitting the US. Like it's a crisis of US capitalism, of like many things happening together, right? Like the limits to growth discourse comes out at the same time. It's just like so many things are in flux.
I'm so glad you brought that up because I really want to talk with you about limits to growth. But let me just go back to Wheeler and Everett for a second. This is why I wanted you on the podcast, because I can talk with you about all of this stuff that I'm obsessed with from both of my books. But the story with Wheeler and Everett, as I understand it, is Everett is interested in basically punking the measurement problem, trying to find a way out of this horrible fix that quantum physics was in, with trying to figure out, okay, what is a measurement and what is going on in the quantum world. And we are not going to get into exactly what the measurement problem is on this podcast episode, because that would take another hour. And if you want to know about that, you can, I don't know, go get my book or something.
But it's stake, right? Is that, is the universe deterministic, or are there elements of uncertainty? That's the stakes, right? I think. That's part of the stakes. Or that's part of the stakes,
right? Yeah. Part of the stakes is like determinism versus randomness at the fundamental level. Part of it is, can physics be done without talking about the physicists? Part of it is physics about the world as it is, or is physics about doing physics? What is it that we're doing when we do physics? There's a lot of really deep questions at work.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? The observer observed alone is like a huge problem. Like that you can't separate the measurement from the measurement instrument.
Exactly. And then Everett comes in and says, oh, one way of solving this problem is, which weirdly is a way of championing the idea that physics is really about the world as it exists, rather than just being a kind of tool for issuing forth predictions, Everett says, yeah, one way that you could do that is you could say that quantum physics is about the universe splitting off into a bunch of, separate individual universes. And Wheeler likes this for certain reasons, but is also nervous about this for other reasons, including Wheeler's relationship with Niels Bohr, the granddaddy of quantum physics. And long story short, again, this is all in What Is Real.
We could talk about this for hours.
Yeah, we could talk about this for hours. We should have a separate call and talk about this. But long story short, Wheeler sends Everett to go talk to Bohr. It doesn't go well. Everett leaves physics. And not because of that, but because he doesn't really want to be an academic physicist anyway, wants to make money and have a madman lifestyle, and goes into defense contracting. And I am surprised by hearing that Wheeler was advocating for Everett to have a higher security clearance in the late 60s, because I did not know that Everett and Wheeler were still really in contact very much between the late 50s when Everett was working with Wheeler and the early to mid 70s when Everett makes contact with Wheeler's people down in Texas.
There's this letter from 68, but I think they maintain this weird, I think Wheeler has really ambivalent feelings, right? About Everett and many worlds. They have this very, like many human relationships, it's a complicated relationship.
Sure.
But I think he feels responsible for Everett's career to some degree. And, Everett's not the only one. Tons of Wheeler students go into defense contracting.
No,
and
absolutely.
Sort of this Cold War, they staff the Cold War state. But one of the things that this new idea of use quantum computing does for this particular problem, right, is that it opens up the idea that you can show that, these weird quantum experiments are real because, right, they've only been, up until then they've been done in a laboratory. But if you're building a quantum computer and you actually successfully do it, it's a proof of concept of some of these weirder contentions. So there's that.
Yeah.
And then also there's the possibility that you might be able to resolve this question, is many worlds or the Copenhagen interpretation, which is don't worry about what this means, basically.
Yeah.
Which one is right? And actually, so far it hasn't done that, and it may never do it, but it sort of defers that problem, right? Because you're someday this will be solved if we can build a quantum computer. And actually, there's the more tantalizing possibility that you can't build a quantum computer, and there are interesting things that we don't understand about physics that explain that.
Okay, so let's talk about quantum computing for a minute, and then I want to get back to limits to growth.
Well, they're all related, yeah.
Again, this is why I want you on the podcast, because I do this stuff, and people say, "Oh, Adam, you write about so many different weird things," and no, I'm writing about one thing. I'm writing about one.
Or one guy. You could just write about Wheeler, right? You could write about one guy, and you'd be writing about all these things. That's the thing, though. They're all doing that. It's not
you're
me.
Right.
I'm following my actors, right?
Yeah. No, I also don't believe in the great man theory of history. I think that Wheeler is an interesting lens to look at all of this through. Yes. But my feeling about it is, no, I'm writing about the recent past, right? And about the near-term future and how these things are connected and our ideas about these things are connected. Or that's one way of saying what I'm writing about. I don't know. I write about what I'm interested in. But anyway.
But also it's all of these guys, it's not that I'm not finding these, I'm not jumping all over the place. We have our disciplinary differies, set in stone in this weird way. But these guys are not concerned about that. Wheeler is actually very invested in setting up history of science. What I found when I was following physicists around also in the present is that they're constantly thinking about history of science. They're constantly thinking about these other kinds of questions. The is that computing separate from these foundational physics? As I said, all these things are happening at once and influencing each other. And it's great to have histories that sort of segment these things out. It also helps to have these synthetic looks, because one person plays many roles over the course of their career, even in a short period of time. And Wheeler is one of those people, but there's millions of these people. You could decide to focus on William O. Baker, right? You could focus on Norm Augustine. Bill Casey plays so many different roles.
I don't know who those people are, actually.
There's so many guys.
There's a lot of guys. Yeah, it's
who are
true.
Playing all these different roles and doing all these different things. And Wheeler's just a very interesting example.
Yeah.
But he's not, no great men of history, because otherwise you get stuck in the sort of like, okay, then we should empower great men to do, whatever it becomes.
And I do think that that's part of going way back to what we were talking about at the beginning. I think that the seductive power of the great man theory of history is something that's connected to the sort of rocket ships and chrome final frontier idea of space. We can go out into space, and there the great man can, do what it is that he's going to do, and blah, 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 blah. And like, yeah, but none of that's real.
Yeah, it's the figure, the entrepreneur is like Schumpeter's new man, but then he becomes, and it's often a he, let's be real.
Sure.
Yeah. No, I mean, just in their imaginary, right?
Like, yeah, exactly. Yeah, they always imagine it as a dude. Yeah, exactly.
Very often, right? And so, but it becomes really useful, right? There's a reason why Palantir wants to retell the entire history of U.S. industrial production in terms of guys like them. Right? They're totally historically revisionist. It's something that I wrote about in that New York Review of Books article, but they're rewriting history. And I think that they're very attentive to history. Wheeler's very attentive to history. The fact that as a society, we sort of take this as like a soft science and not STEM, it's a mistake, right? Because everyone else is focused on history. And there's this idea that like studying histories and futures are separate, but they kind of remake each other. What I was getting at with Moore's Law, right? The power of like this sort of way of thinking about the future also has remade our ability to think about the past in certain ways that are really interesting. And it happens reciprocally too, right? Like if you think about history in terms of stages of development, where technology is the primary actor, where great men who speak for technology are the primary actors, where you get something different about like what you should do in the future, or who controls the future, who can predict the future. And these things have performative effects. Like if you believe the world to be a certain way and you act on it, the world may become more like it, may become less like it. But anyway, yeah, so that's my investment in history, why you should become a historian.
So I'm gonna take a stab at explaining what a quantum computer is, and then I want you to explain why you see quantum computing and limits to growth as connected, because I just normally that's a question that somebody would ask me, and I love that I get to ask you this question. So quantum computing is this idea that we can use special quantum properties, like particular quantum properties of matter, to perform computing in a completely different way, where instead of having bits that are either 0 or 1, you have quantum bits or qubits that can take any sort of state between 0 and 1, and you can combine them and connect their states using a phenomenon called quantum entanglement to produce, how do I want to say this? You can use all of these quantum properties to gain certain kinds of computational powers that classical computers can't match. That is not to say that quantum computers can do... First of all, that's not to say that quantum computers exist. That's all in theory. I mean, quantum computers do exist, but that's not to say
the ones that fulfill the promises of the field of actually being able to do things faster in a way that is meaningful and practicable. They don't, right?
Right. Those don't exist yet. And that's also not to say that quantum computers can do everything better, or even most things better than the computers we already have. Everyone agrees that the computers that we already have are better and will remain better at basically everything, even if those sort of theoretical quantum computers become real.
And yeah, it's not really obvious, besides like screwing up internet encryption for everyone, what it would do. It's not an obvious case for it, but because it's, what it does really well is it factors large numbers. It's very good at the factoring number, which is the basis of internet encryption through this algorithm called RSA. Now there are post RSA algorithms that work well enough, and they're being implemented in certain places, but you can see how this is a concern for, government agencies and whomever, but it gets conflated with like, oh, this will be computing 2.0, this will be and there's a moment where you could believe that, right? Like there's a moment where like silicon isn't hegemonic in the 80s, where they're like, okay, maybe like heat diffusion would be a problem, maybe like silicon won't scale, maybe we need an alternate model. And everything's getting smaller anyways. We want something like Moore's Law to continue. Like Moore's Law helps you overcome the idea of limits to growth, right? And so quantum computing as
Mm-hmm.
an answer to all these intersecting problems in the 80s looks like it might be able to do all of these things at once.
Oh, I didn't know people were talking about it like that in the 80s.
Yeah, well, because the 1981 conference, co-sponsored by IBM and MIT at Endicott House, like the advertisements are about basically, yeah, like computers are getting smaller. We don't know if Moore's law, like the Moore's law can continue, but
Yeah.
maybe this is the vehicle for it. This is maybe the
Huh.
natural progression of computing. And, there's all these physics elites, it's a bunch of weird people too, but there's enough physics elites that buy into this and are interested at the intersection of computing and physics, like Feynman, like Wheeler, like Freeman Dyson. They're all at this
Yeah.
early conference. Not to say
Yeah.
that there's plenty of really fun, weird people there too. Or like Ed Fredkin, who's a fascinating character between legitimacy and not so legitimate stuff. And some of the research that comes out of that, right? So the 1981 conference convinces Feynman that reversible computing, or like he has a talk with Charles Bennett.
Yep.
That convinces him that reversible computing is real. And then he starts doing this really interesting course with John Hopfield and Carver Mead at Caltech about like the future of computing, basically, like different models of the future of computing. And out of that come Carver Mead is sort of the avatar for Moore's law and silicon transistors. Hopfield is the beginning of like neural nets, and Feynman obviously has this. I mean, I don't need to gloss Feynman, but that all comes out of that quantum computing conference, and these discussions about quantum foundations and the future of computing are all happening at the same time with the same people.
I didn't know that people were talking in the 80s about quantum computing as a way of possibly getting around limits to growth and continuing Moore's law. That's so good. I mean, I don't like that they were doing that, but I love it in a way. It's kind of perfect because it doesn't work. I mean, I'm not saying that quantum computing doesn't work, that we're never going to build those computers that can break encryption. And it's possible that they'll even be really useful for like simulating matter at a quantum level. We don't know.
I mean, analog quantum computers are doing really interesting simulations.
Oh, man, because the end of Moore's law, which, depending on who you ask, we're either there already or we're on the doorstep of the end of it, or it's already in the
We're
rearview
always
mirror.
already on the end of Moore's law,
Yeah. Yeah, I know. But to be clear, right? Like we are, everyone's always been saying that, but like the transistors can't get much smaller than they are already, right? Because like if they're not, if they're made of silicon, because silicon's made of silicon atoms and they're already about as small as silicon atoms. But like, it's so interesting to me to see the ways that people thought that it could be saved, it could be continued. And like, and if you go look at Limits to Growth, the book, there's this part where they say, oh yeah, when we tell people about the problems that we're finding and the actual limits to growth, we find the most common response is technology will just solve all of these problems. And I'm also just now realizing, as I say this, that we've been talking about Limits to Growth, and I never explained what it is. Limits to Growth is a book from like 1972 that was really influential throughout the 70s and into the 80s, that basically introduced the public to the idea that we live in a finite world, but experience exponential growth in various different things, and made the claim that that is not sustainable, a claim that I think in broad strokes has to be correct, but there's been surprising amounts of resistance to it ever since it first showed up.
Yeah, I mean, it's still the bogeyman of people like Elon Musk. He's posting about that even today. And because, right, it kind of challenges this imagined American capitalist model. Now, I think that like the way that you measure growth has a lot to do with it, right? We measure it through GDP, and like that's changed a lot. And actually, the guys who originally came up with GDP were like, please don't use this metric. It's a terrible metric.
I feel like that's true of almost like, every metric, right? All of the widely used metrics. If you go back and look at who first came up with it, they were like, please don't use this. This is not a big deal. Please, please,
I know,
please.
I'm begging you, don't generalize it. Yeah,
exactly. And then everyone does anyway, and it's awful. Oh my God, I didn't know that about GDP in particular. particular, but I'm not surprised. Jesus.
Yeah, there's some great histories of GDP that are about that and like what gets measured and what doesn't. But anyway, yeah, it's a very particular way of measuring it. But people kind of assume that that is like it works, like in that like we should be able to just continue whatever growth means along those lines, for forever. And like limits to growth is, yeah, that you explained it very well. But it's still something that it is something that these guys are shadow boxing with.
Yeah.
It's like so many other ways of tackling this question of like, how do you build prosperity or wealth, or like what are governments for, like what.
Yeah.
But I think back to what you were saying about technology as an agent of history is I gave the example of like how people experience it in their everyday life through AI. But I think the fetishism that we have about technology, like the way that we personify, especially AI makes it so easy to talk about, right? Because there's this fetishism about like, is it alive? Is it conscious?
Yep.
But part of that is because of the displaced social and political relationships that we're vesting in technology, when in fact, like the decisions are made out, like not, the tech is not acting. The decisions are made by like everything around the technology.
Yeah.
So again, I think we're seeing this like this return of the same problem, that like social problems and political problems can somehow be solved technically.
Yep.
And by technology, it evolves, right? By technology, when in fact, like embedded in a lot of these choices, or, like sort of hidden by a lot of these choices, are actually we're just doing politics. We're just, social engineering. I mean, there's a strain of STS, science and technology studies too, like Michel Kawan, who are like, it's this big idea in the 80s that like, engineers are actually functioning as sociologists. And, like Wheeler, right? He's functioning as a historian. They're sort of usurping our roles without saying as much, because what we do is actually really important. This is part of the claim that I'm making, is like, they think it's important, but they won't say it, right? And everything is politics. Yeah. So we're just deferring it. But that's where this fetishism comes. It's really like not that different from like commodity fetishism, right? Where social relationships are happening displaced. Like, right. So you have these social relationships of production that are displaced onto objects, right? And so it seems as though the objects are acting and having social relationships, while the people are having object-like relationships, right? And so you can think about tech fetishism in a similar way, right? By thinking about the way in which social and political decisions are displaced onto tech, but it's not actually the tech acting. It's these other things, right? It's these things that happen to create the tech, to regulate or not regulate it, it's not even specific. It's like a problem of mass production too, right? Like when you think about housing, right? Like, and how we build housing. Well, we made some decisions. Well, not we, I should say. Some people made some decisions about how to automate housing production. That meant that like certain things are prioritized and not others. These are political decisions, but there are certain supply chains and skills that have been lost along with that, so that we can't build the kinds of great public housing that we did in the 20s. Some of that is political economic, like we don't have a HUD anymore, but some of it is like, or, we don't have a federal housing authority that does that much. But part of it is, like we also decided to automate parts of, housing construction, just construction in general. And so we lost all this. We lost the supply chains. We lost the technical know-how at all these different places. These are the same questions we're facing with AI. They're not new questions. They're political questions. They're social questions. We all talk about it as though AI is going to create all this unemployment. It's like, no, or AI is making me work harder for less money. It's like, that's not really what's happening. Someone's making these decisions. There are collectives making these decisions.
We have to wrap up in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about what you just said and about the problem with this narrative, especially when you're trying to break out of this, shadow boxing with limits to growth that you were just talking about, with which Musk absolutely does. Jeff Bezos does it too. I think, and I suspect you think too, just from the way that you're talking, that, we can do better with this and a better world is possible. But to do that, we have to not just cede this power to saying that the future is going to be determined by these technologies like AI.
Yeah, when my students, I'll give these lectures, about automation, the history of automation, because again, it's not new. The automation of office a lot of office work meant not that there were fewer office jobs, but there were more. They were just like not unionized and shittier jobs, right? And that's kind of what's happening with AI. Is that there's that AI as African intelligence, not artificial intelligence, because there's so much human labor going into it.
Mostly from Africa, yeah.
Yeah. But I do think a better world is possible. I think like part of it is like facing up to these questions as genuinely political, social questions about like what society we want to live in. I got these questions at the end of the lecture where they're like, okay, so what industry should I go into? They told me to learn how to code. Clearly that's not the future, right? That industry is going, what industry is safe? And I was like, no, that's the terrain of struggle. You are political actors in a world, where like you get to fight over that. This is what is yet to be determined. And once, like there are obviously like material constraints, right? But a lot of these questions are things that we get to act on. And we just don't see these choices as available. Or like, like obviously like political power and economic power has been so concentrated, especially over the last 10 years. I think it's not something we've registered. And it's part of why AI feels so oppressive and like why we're having the kinds of conversations we're having about technology. Actually, society has changed a lot. But what it is important to make clear to people is that these are not settled questions. Like your job, the job that you want to do, the creative work that you want to do, you can do it. We can live in a world where we want not everything to be automated in a specific way, but it requires you to see this as a political struggle and to figure out like what levers you need to pull, or not you specifically, but like us, a collective, right? Nothing ever happens individually, but like what levers you need to pull to fight those political battles and to win those political battles. Or social, whatever. Yeah, but it's not the technology that's acting. That's what I really wanted them to see. And I hope that we move in that direction.
Well, me too. And I think that that's a great place to stop. So, Susannah, thank you for coming on here. This is a great conversation. And we clearly need to sit down and have a much longer one sometime soon.
Thanks so much for having me on. This is so much fun.
Thanks. Thanks again to this week's guest, Susannah Glickman. Next week, we've got the hosts of our fellow Multitude show, Wow If True, Amanda Silberling and Isabel Kim. We'll be talking about various kinds of weird internet dudes and weird memes that made their way into some of Isabel's writing. And if you've read my work or her work, you probably know what kinds of dudes I'm talking about. To submit questions for future guests and to suggest other guests, and to see more pictures of Babka, join the conversation on Patreon. You can also find us on YouTube, on Instagram at DATMpod, on the web and on Blue Sky at dreamingagainstthemachine.com, or just find us wherever you get your podcasts. Dreaming Against the Machine is a proud member of Multitude Productions. Our executive producer is Nick Carissimi. Our associate producer is Rosie Thomas. Our theme music is by Jared Emerson Johnson. Our show logo is by Nick James. And our fearless leader is Babka, the greatest cat in the observable universe. I'm Adam Becker, and I'll see you next week.